this video, we'll be finishing the tap by cutting the mortise for the cutter as well as making the cutter. Here I have a tap that I've previously made. Thought I'd show you this beforehand, so as we go through the process of making the one for the tutorial, you can visualize it a little bit easier. So here we have the tap with the blade sticking out there. This is the cutting face of the blade. Directly in front of it, there's a groove that's been cut to allow for wood chips to clear. There's the back of the cutter. And on the back side of the cutter, we have the wedge. I'll be using a set screw to hold the blade in position for the tap that I'll be making instead of a wedge, but I'll show you what both look like in the video. Here I have two pictures that I've drawn to show you the location of the mortise for the cutter. Here we can see the end of the dowel. The dotted line here shows the center of the dowel. Here we have the cutter and the wedge behind it. The cutting face of the blade is directly in line with the center of the dowel there, with the rest of the blade and the wedge being behind it. The angle of that wedge is approximately 2 degrees. Here is a side view of the tap. The darker lines here represent the kerf in the dowel, and the thinner lines here represent pencil lines that have been drawn on the dowel. Here you can see the dowel that we've been making with the kerfs cut into it. Right here is the end of the kerf, but you can see that I've drawn on with pencil just by eye. I've continued the kerf, and I've continued that about a full turn around the dowel. And here is where the location of the mortise is. Now you can better see by the drawing that the face of that blade is actually perpendicular to the angle of the kerf. It is not parallel with the sides of the dowel. So to draw that there, I just go by eye, drawing what I think looks perpendicular to the kerf. It doesn't have to be 100% precise. The width of the mortise is determined by the number of teeth per inch that you have. With this tap, I have 4 teeth per inch, and the distance between each kerf is 1/4 of an inch. So that will be the width of the cutter. So here I have the mortise drawn to 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to be using 01 tool steel to make my cutter with, and the material I have is 1/8 of an inch thick. So the thickness of the mortise there is at 1/8 inch. Since I'm going to be using a set screw to hold the blade into place, I don't need to cut a mortise for the wedge. But if you are going to be using a wedge to hold the blade into place, I would still do this part of the process the same way. I would draw out the location of the mortise just for the cutter, then I would mortise it out, and then after that's done, I would pare away that mortise a little bit wider to allow for the wedge to fit in there. Here I have a drawing showing what my tap will look like with the set screw without the wedge. So you can see it's just the same. The cutting face of the blade is on the center line as well, but the set screw is going to be coming in to touch the cutting face instead of the wedge being behind the blade. You could always do the set screw on the other side of the blade, but since my tap is so thin, there's a little bit more material on this side of the blade, so I'm going to be putting the set screw on this side. Here I have the tool steel that I'm going to be using to make my blade out of. It's 1/8 of an inch thick. I'm going to be using this instead of an old file just because it's a little quicker to work with. If you're using an old file, you'll have to anneal it first, which means that you have to heat the file till it's red hot and let it cool down very slowly to soften the steel. Otherwise, the steel will be too hard to work with the hacksaw or files or a grinder. So you can see that with the marker, I have already laid out where I'm going to be cutting. The blade is 1/4 of an inch wide, and its final length will be 3/4 of an inch long. But I won't cut it off until I'm finished working the rest of the blade. just used the bench grinder to roughly shape the cutter. So right now I'm going to use a rough file to continue shaping the cutter closer to size. Once you get the blade roughly shaped so that it's looking like this, you need to bevel off the cutting edge to about 15 degrees. Just like on this blade here. Now that I have my cutter shaped, it's at a confirmed 90-degree angle. I forgot to say that that angle there has to be 90 degrees. And then I have my bevel at about 15 degrees there. So at this point, I'll use my very rough sharpening stones just to sharpen it up a little bit. And then I'm going to harden and temper the blade and then do the final sharpening. Now that I have the cutter roughly sharpened, I'm going to harden it. So what you'll need is a heat source. I'm using a propane torch. You could also use fire pit or a forge if you have one, and the water to cool it off in. You want to heat this up to about a red hot temperature, then quench it into the water and cool it off very quickly. You'll also need to do this in a dark space so that you can better judge the color of the steel. If you're doing it with the lights on in a bright room, it'll be harder to tell the color that the steel actually is. Now that we've hardened the steel, we're going to go to tempering. Right here you can see the effect that the heat does to the steel. When we temper it, we're going to be looking for those colors as well. You can see as the steel got hotter and hotter, it went to a sort of a yellowy color to dark brown, purple, and then blue. When we temper this, we want to get the steel to that brown softness. So I'm going to use the sandpaper to clean off the soot so that the colors will be more visible as we temper it. Tempering the steel uses the same tools that we used to harden it, the torch and some cool water. But instead of heating this up to that bright red color, we're going to slowly heat this steel until that straw color comes out, and then we quench it in the water. Here you can see the color pattern on the steel. There's the dark blue, purple, then the brown and the straw sort of color near the tip of the steel. when I was heating the blade up, I started in this area, and then I take the blade away and let the heat travel up towards the tip. That way you can take a little more time and judge a little better the color near the tip of the blade. If you were to heat the blade up a little too quickly, the heat might not travel through the entire thickness, as well as the color can really travel quickly. So if you don't take your time, heat it up slowly, it might get too soft too quickly. Also, by softening or starting the heat in this area, where I'm actually going to be cutting the blade off, I'll have softer steel to cut through, so it'll make cutting a little bit easier. Now we're ready to cut the mortise for the cutter. So I've positioned the mortise so that the center line there is at the top, and now I'll just cut down by eye, judging plumb. Such a small mortise as this will be a little difficult. But if you're doing a 2 tooth per inch tap, the mortise will be much larger and much easier to cut. There. Now I can just pare away a little bit easier. So I've decided to actually use a wedge to hold this into place. I was going to use a set screw, but there's not really enough material for the screw to grab. So all I did to use a wedge instead was pare the mortise a little bit wider. You can see I already have the cutter in there. I decided this time to have the wedge be inserted from the back instead of the front where the cutter is, like I had in the drawings. I'm just trying this out to see if it works any better, any worse. So here's the material I have for the wedge. I've just cut a taper that I thought might fit, test it out. If it doesn't, you can pare a little bit more off here or there. Once you get it to fit nicely, press it in until it's tight. Use a pencil to mark either end of the wedge. Then you can pull the wedge out and cut it on those pencil marks. You also want to make a little device like this little thing here, for pushing the blade in and out. That'll be what you use to progress the cutter when you're actually making nuts as well. Now you can use a file just to create the groove in front of the cutter. Make sure you make the groove on the cutting face or cutting side of the blade. Well, now we have the tap finished. We have the groove cut in front of the blade. I've got the blade made. I still have to sharpen it, but it's done otherwise. Have the mortise and the wedge made, and the guide blocks all done. So right now, besides the dowel for the handle, we have a finished tap. So in the next video, I'll probably start work on the screw jig, and at some point in that process, we'll have to use the tap to make a nut for it.